A war canine German Shepherd. Didn't recognize his soldier at the shelter, but the story that unfolds will touch your heart. A canine German Shepherd who had once braved the horrors of war now sat in silence behind cold metal bars, forgotten by the world. His once alert ears were folded back, his body rigid, his eyes blank. When a soldier entered the shelter and called his name, there was no response, no tail wag, no spark of recognition. But what no one expected was that this moment would mark the beginning of something extraordinary. What followed was a journey of memory, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a man and the dog who once saved his life. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. It helps us share more inspiring stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances, just like this one. The shelter was quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that clings to you like cold air. Rows of kennels stretched down a concrete corridor, each one holding a life in limbo. In the farthest cage, pressed against the wall, lay a German Shepherd with fur dulled by dust and time. His name, according to the tag clipped on the kennel door, was Shadow. No one had dared get too close. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. He just stared forward, motionless, like he was still somewhere far away. Daniel Carson, now 34, had been back from deployment for 3 years. War had aged him beyond those years, lines etched across his brow, his jaw always tight, eyes always searching. He wasn't supposed to be here today. His original flight had been canceled, rerouted, then delayed again. But something in his gut had told him not to go home just yet. Instead, he found himself driving out to the East Ridge Animal Shelter with no real plan in mind. Just a feeling. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe, just maybe, it was hope. As he walked past the kennels, his boots echoed on the floor, drawing the eyes of dogs that still cared enough to hope for a visitor. But Daniel wasn't looking for just any dog. He was looking for him. They had served together in Afghanistan. Daniel and Shadow, a military canine trained for search and rescue, explosives detection, and protection. Shadow had saved Daniel's life more than once. They had been inseparable. But after a mission gone wrong and a chopper evacuation under fire, Shadow was listed as missing in action. The military had marked him lost, and Daniel had believed it. Until last week, when he saw a grainy online post from a shelter halfway across the state. Unadoptable male German Shepherd, no known name, found wandering near a freight yard, severely dehydrated, likely abused, but the eyes in that photo, Daniel recognized those eyes. When he reached the end of the row, he froze. There he was. Shadow didn't move. His head rested on his front paws. His ears didn't twitch, not even at Daniel's voice. "Shadow," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. The dog didn't react, not even a blink. Daniel crouched slowly, ignoring the sting in his knees and the lump forming in his throat. He called the name again, a little louder this time. "Shadow. It's me. It's Danny." Still nothing. A shelter worker passed behind him and said quietly, "He doesn't respond to anything. Won't eat unless no one's watching. Won't let anyone touch him. I don't think he even knows where he is anymore." Daniel looked at her, then back at the dog. This wasn't the Shadow he remembered. The Shadow he knew would run toward him in the middle of gunfire, bark on command, leap into danger without hesitation. But this dog was broken. And yet, Daniel couldn't walk away. He stayed there for nearly an hour, sitting cross-legged on the cold floor outside the kennel. He told stories out loud, softly, about their missions, the desert, the nights spent under the stars with only each other to rely on. He reminded Shadow of their rituals, of the phrases they used. He even reached into his pocket and pulled out a tattered piece of rope, frayed and knotted at one end. The last toy they had played with before their final mission. When he held it up, Shadow's eyes flickered, just barely, but it was enough to make Daniel's heart skip. "You remember this?" he asked gently. Shadow didn't move, but for a fraction of a second, Daniel saw it. A shift. A spark. A whisper of something lost. That's when he knew. This wasn't over. "I'm not leaving you here," Daniel said, his voice steady now. "You came back to me once. Now I'm bringing you home." Behind him, the shelter worker quietly stepped away, but Daniel stayed. He wasn't ready to go. And maybe, just maybe, Shadow wasn't ready to be found. Yet. Daniel returned to the shelter the very next morning, his military boots echoing once again through the narrow concrete hallway. But this time, he didn't just bring hope. He brought a plan. He had spent the night digging through old storage boxes in his garage, trying to find anything from their time overseas. He'd found Shadow's original harness, the one with the military patch still attached. He found an old clicker they'd used during training. He even found one of Shadow's tags, which had somehow survived years of being buried under dust and memories. When he stepped in front of Shadow's kennel again, the dog remained curled against the wall. He didn't bark. He didn't even lift his head. But Daniel didn't expect him to. Not yet. He sat down slowly, cross-legged like the day before. Then, one by one, he placed the items in front of the gate. The harness, the tag, the toy rope, and finally, the clicker. He clicked it once. A sharp metallic sound cut through the silence. Shadow's ear twitched. Daniel didn't move. He clicked again, and this time the dog lifted his head, just slightly. "Yeah," Daniel whispered, emotion rising in his throat. "I know you hear me." Shadow's eyes met his for the first time in days. It wasn't recognition, not fully, but it wasn't nothing either. Daniel visited every day after that. He learned Shadow's new rhythms, the way he flinched at sudden movement, the way he tensed whenever footsteps echoed too loudly, the way his eyes glazed over when someone reached for him. It wasn't just trauma, it was survival. The dog had endured something more than just abandonment. He had been through hell. And yet, Daniel never pushed. He didn't demand recognition. He didn't try to force the past back. He simply showed up every single day and sat in front of that kennel. Sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for 3 hours. He talked, he hummed. He even read aloud old letters he'd written during deployments. And always, he brought the rope toy. Shadow would look at it sometimes. He even sniffed it once. But he never moved closer. Not until day 9. Daniel sat quietly that morning, fingers wrapped around the rope toy, clicking gently every few minutes, whispering old commands and familiar phrases. That's when Shadow stood. It was slow, tentative. His joints cracked, his body stiff. But he stood. Daniel didn't breathe. The dog took 2 steps forward, then 3. And then he stopped. His face pressed close to the gate, his eyes locked on Daniel's. Still no bark, no wag. But his nose touched the frayed end of the rope. A jolt of warmth surged through Daniel's chest. "You remember," he whispered, tears stinging the corners of his eyes. "I knew you would." A moment later, the shelter worker returned with a clipboard. She looked stunned. "He's never done that for anyone. Are you ready to adopt him?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared at Shadow, who was now sitting quietly, still watching him. "He's not ready," Daniel said finally, voice calm but firm. "But I am." She hesitated. "Most people wouldn't wait this long." Daniel stood. I'm not most people, and he's not most dogs. Over the next week, Daniel began the slow process of transitioning Shadow out of the shelter. It wasn't simple. Shadow wouldn't leave his kennel without trembling. He refused to get into a car. He barked at sudden sounds and had a hard time eating with anyone in the room. But Daniel didn't give up. He talked to behaviorists. He worked with veterans who specialized in canine trauma. He set up a quiet space in his home. No mirrors, soft lights, low noise. He even started sleeping on the floor next to Shadow's bed so the dog wouldn't feel alone at night. There were setbacks. Shadow bit through a leash one day when a car backfired near the house. Another time, he destroyed a door frame when Daniel left the room for 5 minutes. But there were victories too, like the first time Shadow licked his hand, or the day he finally curled up next to Daniel's boots, like he used to in the desert sand. And then, one night, 2 weeks after leaving the shelter, Daniel woke to a weight pressed against his chest. Shadow was lying across him, his head resting where a rifle used to. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He cried because finally, after all the silence, all the distance, all the waiting, Shadow had come home. Daniel knew healing wouldn't follow a straight path. For a war dog like Shadow, trauma carved deep, invisible trenches. Some days progress felt like a miracle. Other days, it vanished without warning. 3 weeks after bringing Shadow home, Daniel decided to test a new routine. The vet had recommended light exposure to familiar settings, open space, controlled noise, and clear exits. It was time to see if Shadow could manage a quiet walk through the nearby Pine Hollow Nature Trail. It wasn't far, just a couple of miles through tall grass and pine trees, away from the chaos of the world. It felt like the kind of place where a soldier might learn to breathe again. He loaded Shadow gently into the back of his old pickup, tossing the rope toy in with him. The dog still wouldn't let Daniel lift him, but he stepped inside on his own. A small but powerful victory. The trailhead was almost empty that morning. Birds chirped in the distance, and the breeze stirred the tall weeds like whispers. Daniel opened the back door and stepped aside, waiting. Shadow hesitated. Then his paw touched dirt. Step by step, they walked side by side, connected by a loose leash and something much deeper, an invisible thread of shared pain and memory. Shadow sniffed the air, his ears turning slightly. He didn't flinch at the distant rustling. He didn't panic at the breeze. For a few minutes, it felt almost normal until a jogger turned the corner at full speed. Shadow's body jolted. He froze in place, tail stiff, breath shallow. Easy, Daniel whispered, dropping to a crouch. It's okay, buddy. You're safe. But Shadow's eyes weren't seeing the forest anymore. They were seeing something else, something far away. His breathing quickened. A growl rumbled in his throat. His muscles tensed. The jogger slowed, confused by the tension in the air. Daniel held up a hand. Give us space. The jogger nodded and backed away without a word. Daniel turned back. Shadow, it's not real. It's not war anymore. You're here. You're home. Slowly, Shadow's growl faded. His body sagged, and he let out a long, low whimper before sitting down, head hanging. It broke Daniel's heart. He knelt in front of him and placed a hand on his shoulder. I know. I feel it too. They didn't finish the trail that day. Daniel didn't care. They had come far enough. Just being out there was a kind of bravery most people wouldn't understand. Back at home, Daniel filled Shadow's bowl and sat on the floor beside him. He watched the dog eat for the first time without checking the door or flinching at kitchen noises. It was a good sign. That night, Daniel pulled out an old photo from the deployment. It was faded and scratched, but the image was clear enough. Daniel, dressed in tan fatigues, crouched in the dirt with Shadow beside him, tongue out, ears perked. He set the photo down beside Shadow's bed. You saved me back then. he whispered. "Now it's my turn." A few days later, an envelope arrived in Daniel's mailbox with the military seal. He hadn't seen one of those in years. Inside was a letter from the K9 unit coordinator who had helped him track down Shadow's history. It detailed the missions they'd lost track of, the outpost bombing that separated them, and how Shadow had been found 6 months later by a civilian transport team in northern Kandahar, alone, injured, and unidentifiable without a handler to claim him. He had been passed from base to base, deemed too unstable for reassignment. Eventually, they had sent him back to the States, labeled as damaged, forgotten. Daniel's hands shook as he read the words. "How many of us get lost like this?" he murmured to himself. That night, he printed copies of the photo and the letter and placed them in a small wooden frame. He hung it on the wall just above Shadow's bed. As he stood back and looked at it, he saw the shape of a new mission forming, not one of war, but of purpose. Shadow had come back from the darkest place imaginable, so had he. Maybe together, they could light the way for others who hadn't found their way home yet. Just then, Shadow lifted his head and looked at him, not with fear or confusion this time, but with something else. A spark. Maybe even a flicker of joy. Daniel smiled, reached for the rope toy, and gave it a soft toss across the room. And for the first time in years, Shadow rose, padded forward, and brought it back. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It came in fragments. A tail wag here, a gentle nudge there, a quiet moment of peace in the middle of the night. Daniel marked each one like a soldier counting stars. But the outside world didn't pause for healing. And soon, a new challenge came knocking. It started with a letter. A neighbor had submitted a complaint to the local animal control office. Shadow's deep barks during night terrors had startled nearby residents. Some claimed he sounded aggressive. Others said they'd seen Daniel walking a dangerous, unstable dog. They were afraid, and fear bred accusations. The officer who showed up that morning was polite but firm. "Mr. Carson, I'm here for a routine evaluation. Nothing formal yet, but we've had multiple reports. We just need to verify that your dog isn't a danger to the community." Daniel's heart sank. He's a former war K9. He's not dangerous. He's healing. "I understand," the officer replied gently. "But if we receive more complaints or witness anything concerning, it may escalate." Daniel watched as the officer approached Shadow cautiously. The dog stood silently at the edge of the porch, body still, ears forward. He didn't growl, he didn't flinch, but he didn't approach either. The officer wrote something in his notepad, nodded, and left with a brief, "We'll be in touch." The door had barely closed when Daniel slumped against it, fists clenched. This was exactly what he feared. Shadow had done nothing wrong. But the world didn't see a wounded hero. They saw a threat. Later that day, Daniel called a friend from his old unit, Sergeant Luis Monroe, who now worked with a veteran-led K9 rehabilitation group in Colorado. Luis had always been the guy who knew how to navigate red tape and government bureaucracy with a mix of charm and sheer force of will. "You need to get ahead of this," Luis said firmly. "Reframe the story before someone else writes it for you. I've seen too many good dogs put down because no one told their truth fast enough." "So what do I do?" "Let the Juan see who he really is. Let them see what you two survived. Educate. Show them the bond. Host an event. Give a talk. Volunteer at the local community center. Don't wait for them to come after him." Daniel hesitated. The thought of standing in front of strangers, explaining Shadow's trauma, made his chest tighten. But the alternative? Unthinkable. That weekend, he reached out to a local veterans group and asked if he could speak at their monthly community dinner. They agreed, enthusiastically. When the night arrived, Daniel stood on a small stage in a room filled with military families, teenagers, and elderly vets, Shadow lay at his feet, still and calm, his harness polished, his eyes alert. Daniel took a deep breath. Then he began. He spoke of the desert, the missions, the long nights filled with dust and danger. He spoke of how Shadow had once pulled him out of a collapsed building after an explosion, of how the dog had lost pieces of himself out there, not just physically, but emotionally. He showed photos, read the letter from the K9 coordinator, told them how Shadow had returned to him, broken and forgotten. "But he's not a danger," Daniel said, voice cracking. "He's a survivor, like so many of us. He just needs patience. He needs understanding. He needs a second chance." When he finished, the room was silent. Then an older woman in the front row, her hair gray, her eyes glassy, stood up slowly and walked over. Without a word, she knelt beside Shadow and reached out. The dog stared at her hand, and then he licked it. The room exhaled all at once. Applause broke out, soft at first, then louder. People came up to shake Daniel's hand, to pet Shadow, to share their own stories of war, of trauma, of survival. The next morning, a local reporter published an article titled, "A War Hero's Second Chance: The Story of Shadow." Photos of Shadow sitting proudly beside Daniel flooded social media. Comments poured in, words of support, gratitude, even apologies from those who had once feared him. Animal control didn't follow up again. Instead, the officer who had visited sent a message. "I read the article. Thank you for your service, and for his." That night, Daniel and Shadow walked the Pine Hollow Trail again. No flinches, no fear. Only the quiet rhythm of two survivors finding peace, one step at a time. And for the first time in months, Shadow barked, just once. But it was full and strong and echoed through the trees like a call home. 3 months after the shelter, Shadow had become unrecognizable, not in appearance but in spirit. The hollow-eyed shell of a dog that once flinched at the wind was now alert, responsive, and even playful on good days. Daniel couldn't walk him through town without people stopping to say, "Is that the war dog from the article?" Shadow would sit patiently, even allow cautious hands to stroke his back. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. But one phone call nearly unraveled everything. It came late on a Tuesday night. Daniel recognized the number immediately. It was the Department of Defense. "Mr. Carson," the voice said on the other end, formal and measured. "We're calling regarding the service animal currently in your possession, originally designated K9 S117, call sign Shadow." Daniel sat upright, instantly alert. "Yes, that's right." There was a pause. "We've been reviewing old files for our military working dog retirement program." A red flag came up. Shadow was never officially decommissioned. Technically, he's still government property. Daniel's stomach dropped. "Wait, what are you saying?" "What we're saying is that, as it stands, the adoption process was invalid. He may be recalled for reassignment or reassessment depending on current capacity and need." "No," Daniel said sharply. "You can't take him. He's not a machine. He's not a piece of equipment. He's mold." "I understand how you feel, Mr. Carson. This isn't personal, but Shadow is still under contract, and we have to follow protocol. You'll receive an official review request in the coming days." The call ended. Daniel sat in silence. Shadow lay nearby, eyes half closed, his chest rising and falling with peaceful, steady breaths. The idea of anyone taking him again, of ripping him from yet another home, was unthinkable. But protocol didn't care about unthinkable. The next day, Daniel contacted Luis again. "They want to take him back," he said, pacing his living room. "They're calling it a clerical error, a technicality." Luis cursed under his breath. "They've done this before, man. It's rare, but it happens. Especially when a dog's still listed as active. But there's a way." "I'm listening." You need to prove that reclaiming Shadow would cause him psychological harm, that it would violate his welfare as a retired K9. It's not easy, but if you can get a military veterinarian, a licensed canine behaviorist, and ideally a mental health professional to vouch for you and the dog, it could sway the decision. Daniel didn't hesitate. He spent the next 4 days gathering letters, statements, files. He got the shelter director to write about Shadow's condition upon arrival. He met with the local vet, who described the PTSD symptoms Shadow still carried. Even his own therapist wrote a letter, detailing how Shadow's presence was part of Daniel's recovery from combat trauma. But nothing mattered more than the moment that came next. Daniel sat down at his kitchen table and began to write his own letter. He didn't write it as a soldier. He wrote it as a man who had been saved by a dog. He wrote about the night he nearly ended his own life, the silence of his house, the weight on his chest, the call he almost didn't answer. He wrote about finding that post online, about Shadow's eyes in the photo, about the feeling of hope, small and trembling, pushing back against despair for the first time in years. He wrote about watching Shadow come back to life, and how, in doing so, the dog gave him a reason to live. "You may own his serial number," Daniel typed, his hands shaking. "But I carry his story, and that story doesn't belong in a file cabinet." 2 weeks later, the official letter arrived. Daniel tore it open with his heart in his throat. After careful consideration and review of the documentation provided, we are pleased to inform you that K9S117 Shadow is hereby officially decommissioned from active service. All ownership rights are now transferred to Mr. Daniel Carson, effective immediately. Daniel read the words again and again. Then he dropped the letter and collapsed to the floor, arms around Shadow's neck, sobbing into the dog's fur. Shadow didn't flinch. He just stayed there, quiet, steady, loyal. Home. That night, Daniel placed the letter in a frame beside their photo on the wall. Shadow, now free from the weight of ownership and contracts and war, laid down at Daniel's feet and slept like he hadn't slept in years. For the first time since everything began, the nightmare was over. Or so they thought. 3 months after the shelter, Shadow had become unrecognizable, not in appearance but in spirit. The hollow-eyed shell of a dog that once flinched at the wind was now alert, responsive, and even playful on good days. Daniel couldn't walk him through town without people stopping to say, "Is that the war dog from the article?" Shadow would sit patiently, even allow cautious hands to stroke his back. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. But one phone call nearly unraveled everything. It came late on a Tuesday night. Daniel recognized the number immediately. It was the Department of Defense. "Mr. Carson," the voice said on the other end, formal and measured. "We're calling regarding the service animal currently in your possession, originally designated K9S117, call sign, Shadow." Daniel sat upright, instantly alert. "Yes, that's right." There was a pause. "We've been reviewing old files for our military working dog retirement program." A red flag came up. Shadow was never officially decommissioned. Technically, he's still government property. Daniel's stomach dropped. "Wait, what are you saying?" "What we're saying is that, as it stands, the adoption process was invalid. He may be recalled for reassignment or reassessment depending on current capacity and need." "No," Daniel said sharply. "You can't take him. He's not a machine. He's not a piece of equipment. He's Mo." "I understand how you feel, Mr. Carson. This isn't personal, but Shadow is still under contract, and we have to follow protocol. You'll receive an official review request in the coming days." The call ended. Daniel sat in silence. Shadow lay nearby, eyes half closed, his chest rising and falling with peaceful, steady breaths. The idea of anyone taking him again, of ripping him from yet another home, was unthinkable. But protocol didn't care about unthinkable. The next day, Daniel contacted Luis again. "They want to take him back," he said, pacing his living room. "They're calling it a clerical error, a technicality." Luis cursed under his breath. "They've done this before, man. It's rare, but it happens. Especially when a dog's still listed as active. But there's a way." "I'm listening." "You need to prove that reclaiming Shadow would cause him psychological harm, that it would violate his welfare as a retired canine. It's not easy, but if you can get a military veterinarian, a licensed canine behaviorist, and ideally a mental health professional to vouch for you and the dog, it could sway the decision." Daniel didn't hesitate. He spent the next 4 days gathering letters, statements, files. He got the shelter director to write about Shadow's condition upon arrival. He met with the local vet, who described the PTSD symptoms Shadow still carried. Even his own therapist wrote a letter, detailing how Shadow's presence was part of Daniel's recovery from combat trauma. But nothing mattered more than the moment that came next. Daniel sat down at his kitchen table and began to write his own letter. He didn't write it as a soldier. He wrote it as a man who had been saved by a dog. He wrote about the night he nearly ended his own life, the silence of his house, the weight on his chest, the call he almost didn't answer. He wrote about finding that post online, about Shadow's eyes in the photo, about the feeling of hope, small and trembling, pushing back against despair for the first time in years. He wrote about watching Shadow come back to life, and how, in doing so, the dog gave him a reason to live. "You may own his serial number," Daniel typed, his hands shaking. "But I carry his story, and that story doesn't belong in a file cabinet." 2 weeks later, the official letter arrived. Daniel tore it open with his heart in his throat. After careful consideration and review of the documentation provided, we are pleased to inform you that K9 S117 Shadow is hereby officially decommissioned from active service. All ownership rights are now transferred to Mr. Daniel Carson, effective immediately. Daniel read the words again and again. Then he dropped the letter and collapsed to the floor, arms around Shadow's neck, sobbing into the dog's fur. Shadow didn't flinch. He just stayed there, quiet, steady, loyal. Home. That night, Daniel placed the letter in a frame beside their photo on the wall. Shadow, now free from the weight of ownership and contracts and war, laid down at Daniel's feet and slept like he hadn't slept in years. For the first time since everything began, the nightmare was over. Or so they thought. Gently, Daniel inched closer, lowering his body flat to the floor until he could slide a hand beneath Shadow's neck. "You're not there anymore, buddy. I promise I'm right here." Minutes passed before Shadow blinked, then looked at Daniel. Recognition crept back into his expression like light through fog. It took another hour before Shadow stood on his own. That night, Daniel sat on the floor beside him again, a blanket draped over both of them. "I thought we were past it," Daniel whispered, guilt gnawing at him. "I should have known the sounds would trigger something." Shadow shifted closer, resting his chin on Daniel's thigh. "We can't outrun it, huh?" Daniel murmured. "Even when it's quiet, it finds a way back in." The next day, Daniel made a decision. He called Luis and asked about further trauma support, not just for dogs, but for humans and canines together. Luis responded immediately. "Come stay with us for a few days. We've got a facility now out in the mountains. No noise, no pressure, just peace. We'll work with both of you." Daniel hesitated. "You think it'll help? I mean, we've come so far." Luis's voice softened. "Healing isn't a straight road, brother. Sometimes it loops back before it goes forward. Let us help you both move through it, not around it." So Daniel packed a bag. He filled a duffel with Shadow's favorite things: his toy rope, the old harness, the clicker, and the photo that never left the wall. As they drove out of town, Shadow lay calmly in the back seat, his head resting on his paws. The facility was tucked in the Rockies, wide open meadows, pine forests, a river that cut through the valley like a silver thread. No traffic, no sudden bangs, only the wind in the trees and the chirp of birds, and people who understood. Veterans. Dogs. Men and women who bore the same unseen bruises. For the first time, Daniel didn't feel like he was holding everything together alone, and neither did Shadow. In the days that followed, they worked with trainers side by side. Shadow was introduced to a technique called dual desensitization, experiencing triggering sounds at the lowest volume possible, paired with positive reinforcement and the presence of a calm handler. Daniel learned breathing techniques, grounding exercises, even canine massage therapy. Progress came quietly, but it came. One morning, as the sun crept across the frost-covered field, Daniel stood beside Shadow and gave the signal, an old command from their deployment days. "Go wide." Shadow looked up, paused for a second, and trotted ahead through the brush, steady, confident, free. Daniel watched him disappear briefly behind a tree, then reappear with the rope toy in his mouth, tail swaying. He jogged back and dropped it at Daniel's feet. It was the same toy from the shelter, the same one he hadn't touched for weeks after coming home. Daniel knelt and hugged him, tears stinging his eyes. "You're really back, aren't you?" Shadow licked his face, then sat panting softly as if to say, "I never left. I was just trying to find my way." They returned home a week later, different somehow. Not healed entirely, but steadier. Shadow walked through the door with calm steps, nose twitching at the familiar scent of his bed, his bowl, Daniel's boots by the door. He didn't rush, didn't cower. He belonged here now. Life didn't become perfect. There were still echoes of war in their sleep, still flinches at distant thunder or the pop of a car backfiring, but there was also laughter, soft and real. Walks where Shadow ran ahead with ears bouncing. Quiet nights with his head resting on Daniel's lap. A local school invited them for Veterans Day. Daniel spoke, his voice steady as Shadow sat beside him, wearing a new tag that read "Retired, but still serving." The kids clapped. Some cried. Shadow nuzzled a boy in a wheelchair, resting his head gently on the child's knee. He had become more than a dog. He had become a symbol of strength after silence. Months later, Daniel framed one last photo. Shadow curled up beside a little girl in a hospital bed during their first therapy visit. Her hand on his neck. His eyes soft. That picture went next to the one from war. Different places. Same dog. Same heart. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Because sometimes what we think is broken is just waiting to be loved back into the light.